Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about edge computing in the year 2020 and beyond. To discuss that, I'm joined by Abhijit Sanil, an analyst with Forrester. Hello to you, Abhijit.
Hi, James. Thank you for having me. I'm Abhijit. I'm with Forrester Research and analyst with the infrastructure and operations team.
Good.
And I work particularly on edge computing, cloud, and the data centers and co-locations market. And we've looked at the advent of edge computing very closely and recently published the Edge Predictions report that talked about how
Right.
computing is looking in 2020. And I'm happy to chat with you more about how the market looks like.
You certainly are covering some hot markets, to be sure. I think every one of those markets you just mentioned is actually definitely a growth market.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Um, these are some of the pillars that will take us into the next decade, in fact. So,
Well, I was interested. So you made a really interesting prediction about the expected growth of the edge computing market in the year 2020, and I want to get to that, but very
hmm,
briefly, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what exactly edge computing is. I mean, very brief definition. I think of it as the sensor at the edge, the IoT device or the mobile device is doing the data crunching right there, as opposed to sending the data back to the data center or cloud platform. Is that how you think about edge computing?
that's a very good observation and point. In fact, depending on who you ask, you will get varied responses back on what edge computing really is.
Right.
So, defining edge computing is actually rather tricky. But we are here at Forrester. We have a definition that we feel encompasses the true use cases of edge computing. And we talk about edge as edge endpoint resources that help manage and analyze localized data and empower near real-time insights, engagement, and automation within the physical proximity to endpoint devices and customers. So that physical proximity to the customers is key there. So it's ultimately about bringing computing close to where data is generated. And everything in that ecosystem all falls under the umbrella of edge computing, including the software that is used to manage edge devices and bring in the intelligence to those devices on the edge.
Mhm.
So that's the way that we've defined edge computing. And to talk about the market itself, every single aspect of that entire ecosystem, is growing now, and that's very evident in a Forrester survey that we did for 2019, in which we polled mobility decision makers on their implementation and plans to adopt edge computing, and we found that 53% of decision makers are already implementing edge computing across all verticals in the US. And that's a
Wow.
significant number,
It
given
really
how
is.
new edge computing is, actually. Uh,
Well, so is that I want to make sure I'm not mixing up my figures because you had a prediction for the growth in the year 2020 of the complete edge computing market. What how what, by what percentage do you see the market growing next year?
so the prediction that we made was on the edge services market.
Right.
So along with the edge computing growth of the entire platform itself, we feel would be growth by almost 50% of the
Wow.
services market that is associated with the edge computing ecosystem. So when we look at the market itself, utilities and telecommunications, building construction services, and manufacturing are among the key biggest adopters for edge at this time.
Hmm.
But financial services still are closely following with uh, planned implementations for the next 12 months.
Uh-huh.
So this 53% who responded back to our survey saying they are implementing or have planned to implement or are interested to implement edge computing for the next 12 months
Right.
is indicates the growth of edge computing in terms of how much it is being adopted, and as seen as a growth engine, either as an enabler or as a business in itself by
Right.
companies across the spectrum.
It's interesting. And we don't have to completely answer this. I'm just curious. It might be of all the various markets in the IT sector, whether it's AI, whether it's big data, whether it's cloud,
Mm.
a 50% growth, expected growth in 1 year might make it the fastest growing IT market. I mean, that's off topic, but I mean, would you think it's like either one of the fastest or the fastest growing market in the IT sector?
I would say it is amongst the fastest.
Yeah.
Now, this services space, I want to make that distinction clear on
Okay.
the edge computing ecosystem as a whole. So, like we try to define, edge computing encompasses the infrastructure and the devices, as well as the services and the software and everything that is associated with it. And our prediction was on the services market itself, that brings together all of these edge to the customer,
Mm-hmm.
all of the edge computing resources to the customer. So that growth that we predict for by 50% is certainly significant amongst the most fastest growing IT sector actually.
Right. Well, so what is driving this explosive growth? When I think about 50% growth, I mean it's doubling in the next few years. I mean, what is the need for faster processing? It is the total amount of sensors out there, or what is driving the 50% growth?
Well, so the amount of use cases that edge computing enables is so varied and vast that it is applicable to almost every industry. And
Mm-hmm.
at this time, retail, marketing, and media, manufacturing, all of these industries that are very varied in the technology spectrum
Mm-hmm.
are all interested in edge computing as an enabler for them to bring better customer experience and automation. So um, the key things that drive the interest in edge computing is lower latency. So
Wow.
um,
Right.
edge computing, as we discussed, takes computing closer to where the data is generated.
Right.
So that means real-time analysis of this data and bringing results and actionable decision making close to where the data is generated. We often talk about autonomous cars, for example.
Mm-hmm.
The data that a car on the street would accumulate. There is really not a lot of room for that data to be sent back to a data center or a cloud where it would be analyzed and then again sent information to be sent back to the car so that it could take real-time decisions on what to do
Right.
on the road.
Right.
So use cases such as the autonomous cars in manufacturing, for example, and also to make retail experience very seamless and without a lot of human intervention for customers. This is another use case that's coming into prominence. So for some of these use cases, latency is very critical. Data has to be
Right.
analyzed and in large amounts at where exactly the data is produced itself, and then decisions have to be made very fast.
Mm-hmm.
The second point is on cost. Every industry, every sector is very involved in cost reduction, and edge computing actually drives some of that. With obviating the um, transfer of data from one location to the other, and then computing it in a large data center or cloud, and then bringing it back. That itself reduces cost in terms of
Right.
bandwidth and all of the other associated network transmission. So
Mm-hmm.
that's another big driver that's bringing edge to the attention of such non-traditionally technology sectors such as even banking and finances. So then the third thing, which again is of interest to many of these sectors such as manufacturing and banking, is security.
Ah.
So edge
Okay.
computing enables data to be analyzed and worked upon right at the location without having to worry about all of the compliance and protocol problems of sending it to a public cloud or back to a data center, which may be in a location that might actually incur some regulatory problems to the operator. So so all of this the latency, low latency use cases, the security advantages, the reduction in cost, everything comes together to bring better customer experience.
Right.
And we've said this in at various places at Forrester about how customer experience now is king. And when customer experience um, is at its maximum, we have found that companies perform the best as well. And to enable customer experience, Edge is therefore seen as a very big factor. And uh, along with customer experience is automation,
Uh-huh.
repetitive tasks on that is being automated. It's inevitable that a lot of automation will come into technology at various fronts, and edge computing will enable many of that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I always say it makes sense with all those factors going for it. That would, edge computing would really grow fast. What about some of the leading companies? Can you say what some of the leading vendors are in the sector, or smaller or larger? What is that a question you can answer?
Sure. It's a very broad question because there are multiple vendors across the entire ecosystem, and
Right.
they all play at various in various areas of edge computing.
Hmm.
For example, there are the telecommunications players such
Right.
as AT&T and Verizon, who bring in the connectivity aspect of edge. They
Uh-huh.
are amongst the uh, leading players who've talked about and discussed the possibilities of edge so far. Then there is
Right.
the networking players like such as Cisco, who enable the network behind edge computing.
Hmm.
So the peer-to-peer networks that makes these endpoints talk to each other, and also now with the advent of 5G. So there are these networking players as well who bring in that aspect of edge computing. Then there are the device manufacturers itself who enable IoT. So
Hmm.
amongst the key technology that goes hand in hand with edge now is IoT, the
Uh-huh. Of
Internet of Things
course.
that connects
Right.
various devices. And now manufacturers of IoT devices also play into the edge ecosystem, such as IBM or HPE and others. So
Right.
the vendor landscape on edge is vast and diverse, and depending on what part of edge you're talking about, we find various players playing in that area. And one point to note also is the rise of open source resources in edge
Uh-huh.
computing. Even
Okay.
Kubernetes, for example, has many open source projects that are particularly
Of
targeted
course.
at the edge.
Right. Are you saying that there's Kubernetes plays a role in edge computing?
Yes, they also have various projects that are geared particularly for edge computing. So, in terms of software, in terms of networking, there are a vast, diverse ecosystem of players
Right.
in edge computing, which is what makes this actually very interesting because edge computing is not one particular thing. Like cloud computing, for example, when we spoke, when cloud computing was on the rise, there
Right.
was a clear entity and a few players that were clearly gaining advantage and had a lead or lag positions. However, in Edge, there are multiple ankles to chip away from, and there are various players in the stage now.
What about the role of 5G? Obviously, 5G is on the horizon, and there's
Mm.
many predictions about how it's going to radically alter things. I mean, what about the connection between 5G and edge computing? It seems like it's a match made in heaven. What do you see there?
Yes, yes. In fact, you rightly put it. It is indeed a match made in heaven. The first thing, the advantage that we spoke about for edge computing on latency, for
Huh.
example,
Right.
5G's biggest promise is latency. And when 5G is implemented at scale, many of the use cases for edge computing will actually be at scale in itself too. So when we talk about networking for edge computing, there is the endpoint to the edge connection, the network mesh from endpoints endpoint devices to the edge, and also
Right.
from the edge to the backend cloud for backups and other things. Now,
Right.
in both these places, 5G will play a big role. Now, from the endpoint devices to edge connectivity, for at this time there are a variety of protocols like 4G, and eventually we will see 5G, and then peer-to-peer networks such as Bluetooth or Zigbee and others. But
Hmm.
5G brings in the promise of having just one protocol or 5G network, one network, for the entire ecosystem. And that's
Right.
a big advantage that 5G would bring to the Internet of Things and the edge. And then
Uh-huh.
the other advantage, like we mentioned, is latency. With 5G's higher speeds and bandwidth,
Right.
that will enable many more use cases of edge computing. One example that everybody likes to talk about is autonomous cars, that we
Right.
discussed earlier. Huge amounts of data is generated by an autonomous car, and that data has to be acted upon, and decisions have to be made in real time in such a situation.
Hmm.
5G will enable the communication between these devices, between cars, and all of which has to work in real time to make important decisions.
Hmm.
So, like you said, 5G and edge computing is quite a match made in heaven. And
Right.
IoT also plays a big role in that.
Right. What one last question I'd like to get your sense for the year 2020, or really the next few years.
Hmm.
What do you see in the edge in edge computing in terms of the market? How do you see it changing shape? What's your overall sense of that looking forward?
So we'll see some very interesting changes in the market. So one of
Right.
which we spoke about will be the rise of services around edge computing, that
Right.
we which will be significant amongst the fastest growing IT sector even. And
Uh-huh.
there are a few others that we actually, in fact, even called out in the report. So one is we will start to see more infrastructure and devices that are particularly made for the edge.
Uh-huh.
So currently, in takeoff stage for the edge computing ecosystem, we see that more and more devices and infrastructure are being repackaged and morphed into being operated at the edge.
Uh-huh.
But this we predict will soon change, and we're already seeing examples of companies and startups who are announcing processors, for example, which are custom built to work at the edge. And there are several challenges for devices to function at the edge. For example, now there may be more vibrations in an environment like manufacturing. There,
Mhm.
it has to be more resilient to temperature and other external elements, and also connectivity. Edge, by definition, is computing in remote places on the edges
Right.
of the ecosystem. So,
Yes.
what Connect 5G enables and how edge devices is able to connect with each other, all of that will require custom devices and infrastructure that is tailored for edge, and we'll see more of that in the coming years.
Hmm.
So that's one. Secondly, we will see more partnerships.
Uh-huh.
Uh, like we mentioned, edge computing is a big ecosystem, and there are a variety of actors on the stage who are playing in various parts of the edge ecosystem. And we will certainly see more customer interest in choosing a vendor or a network or a partner in bringing in edge for them, who can bring in other partners with them as well. So this
Right.
is another prediction that we are making,
Okay.
is that nobody will do edge computing on their own. They could be selling parts of it, but a robust partner ecosystem will develop, and that will provide players with an edge. And another key observation that we have is around mergers and acquisitions in line with the whole partnership ecosystem.
Okay.
So typically, traditional telcos had lost out on the competition for cloud, We saw the rise of Google and AWS and Microsoft, who are, significantly ahead in terms of their size
Right.
for public cloud. Uh, Traditional telcos had lost out on that, and we will see more telcos take an active interest in the edge ecosystem and bringing edge to the consumer in a variety of ways. We are already seeing that with AT&T, for example, who have talked quite a bit around edge and 5G. We'll see some interesting changes like that in the market.
Great. Obviously, that's a lot of good stuff. It's obviously some huge changes ahead for the edge computing
Yeah,
market. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise today.
great. Thank you very much for having me. Um, this was a great conversation around edge. I'm always happy to talk more about this because it's upcoming technology, and there will be a lot of interesting changes soon. So we'll be
Great.
watching this closely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. We'll be in touch.